Welcome everyone to episode 40 of Ty's Training, Talking with My Dad. This is the week of February 2nd, 2026. I'm Ty, and here as always with my co-host and wonderful father and his wonderful cat. If you are watching on a video platform, Theodosia there, that's Mr. C. We are here for another look at training and life in the midst of our giant Project Himalaya Run Everest. Mr. C, how you doing? Good to see you back at home after a little vacation. How you feeling?
Doing great. Yeah, really nice. Although it's really freaking cold here, to use a technical term.
Well,
But other than that,
it is.
it's all good. Yeah,
It's February in New England, so as we say, you signed up for this.
yeah, exactly. Yep, it's been particularly a cold and nasty winter so far, with lots of snow and lots of cold. So wind chills below zero this morning.
Oof. Yeah,
But
that's
we're here and it's fine, and we're inside and
brisk.
warm with our cats, which is great.
Excellent.
So let's start with the numbers. And this was the end of your first block of training yesterday. Remind us what blocks are, how you structure them, and give us the breakdown, the totals.
So the way that I think about training structure in terms of the kind of mesocycles, like medium scale, is we have blocks, which are about 3 weeks usually. So this is almost 20 days. And then I take 3 or 4 really, really light days after that. So we're in the midst of what I call my block break right now, which is those 3 or 4 days where I suddenly have an extra like 8 hours of my day, which is wonderful, and can like relax and maybe play some music and go for a walk and see some friends and yeah, things like that, catch up on work, talk to my family, talk to my friends. That's block breaks are always fun, but yeah, the meet was the last 20 days. Which just ended yesterday. So it was, let's see, their numbers here. We had 37 hours of training time per week. I normalized all this like per 7 days because that's just easier for me to think about. So 37 hours of training time, which was almost 14,000 meters per week. So almost 2,000 meters a day, which is a really, really solid start. Again, this is my first block. I'll have 4.5 between now and when I actually, make the summit attempt on Everest. And then the horizontal distance is funny because it's 110 kilometers, which is, I think, about 70 miles, which back in the day was not very much. But nowadays, the horizontal distance is not really something I focus on. It's almost a byproduct of the vert. The vert and the hours is really the big thing. And this was a great way to start it. It was a lot of volume, a lot of vert, and feeling really strong and healthy and excited to get into the next one.
Great. Okay, well, let's dig in. So you had a much quicker Polachowski time to start the week, 71 something or other, and then went all the way to summit for the first time in a while and exceeded in doing that your normal 2 hours and 30 minutes for this block. And I noted in your log, you put in "life is good!" ! So why the longer day, and how important is that 71-minute time?
Well, starting with the life is good, I think it was just a really beautiful day. It's been pretty rainy for us. Luckily, we don't get the freezing cold and snow that y'all get up north, but it has been a pretty rainy last 3 or 4 weeks. And I think it was just a really beautiful day. Felt good. And one of my favorite things about Monday through Thursday is almost no one is on the mountain because the cable car doesn't open until 10 o'clock. So it was just a perfect bluebird sky kind of clear day. All the volcanoes were out and my body was feeling really good. I was moving quick and I said, you know what, it's okay. I'm going to go to the summit today. I haven't been there in a while. And went up there, saw everybody's favorite bird, Steve, maybe even a double Steve. Yeah, really great day. Just super beautiful. And just, one of those 6 words that we go back to, joy. It's important to just embrace that sometimes. Yes, it's work for me. This is my job. And sometimes it's really hard and sometimes it's frustrating and boring and painful, but also sometimes it is really joyful. And I want to embrace that and be grateful for the opportunity to be able to go run up my favorite mountain and have that be my job. That's amazing. So it was a day like that where I just really wanted to embrace that side of joy and also make sure, it fit into the training. It's not like I was doing something crazy or going over my time by 6 hours, an extra 20 minutes isn't going to kill me, but it definitely was me just giving myself permission. Okay, I'm feeling good. The weather's amazing. I'm having a great time. And I'm just going to really enjoy being up here today. And in terms of the time itself, 71 minutes for me, for an easy day, that's like we're talking about low zone 2 is quite solid. I think anything usually on my easy days in the mid 70s to 80 minutes, I kind of think of it when I think about flat running. Back to my days as a marathoner, it was kind of like a 10 miler. So, over 80 minutes, like 8-minute miles is pretty slow. And, under 70 minutes, like especially the day after a hard session is pretty quick, is moving good. So 71 minutes, again, here this early in the buildup, we're still in early February, is a really solid place to be. So I was excited about that. And mostly just, excited to be outside and be on the mountain.
Great. Sounds like fun. Okay. Well, another exciting thing that happened early in the week was your call with Dr. San Milan. So you had a
Hmm.
call with Dr. Inigo San Milan, and can we link to him or something in the show notes so
Yeah,
people can
absolutely.
find him if they want?
Yep.
And I was lucky enough to sort of lurk in the background and listen in, which was great because I'd heard him on a couple of podcasts. He's very famous. He is known as, I guess, Mr. Zone 2, perhaps, and also
Hmm.
is a famous trainer of high-end athletes, especially cyclists. He's a former cyclist by his own background. So anyway,
Yep.
without getting into proprietary details, can you share what you talked about with Dr. San Milan and how working with someone at this level influences your training?
For context, the connection here is through human powered health, which we've talked about a handful of times now this season, which was the lab in, I think it's in Wellesley, Mass, that
Wellesley, right?
we went to back in December, got a bunch of testing done. So Dr. Inigo San Milan is their, I don't know if he's their consultant or just kind of the overseer on the
He's an
metabolic side,
advisor and
especially. Yeah,
part of the
advisor.
practices. Yeah, there's two or
Yeah.
three of them, I
So
think.
and then to give him a little bit more props where props are due, he, I would say, is most known nowadays for being the physiologist for the, I believe it's the UAE cycling team. And he works directly with Tadej Pogacar, who is objectively the strongest Tour de France cyclist, certainly of this generation, arguably of all time. So he works directly with Pogacar and the whole UAE cycling team. He also works with a handful of Premier League football teams. So this guy's working with people who are performing a variety of sports at a high level. He's also worked with Kilian Jornet, which is interesting because he's much closer to what I do in terms of certain projects in physiology and things like that. So long story short, this guy has worked with very, very high level world class athletes across spectrum of sports. And like you said, his academic background is very much in physiology in terms of the metabolic side. So looking at heart rate, lactate, which we'll talk about a lot this episode, and other things like that. So I had a longer call with Evan Hoyt, who was my direct contact at HPH maybe 2 weeks ago. And we talked more about kind of the strength training and balance and stability side, because that was one big takeaway from that lab visit. And then this call with Dr. Samilan was much more about blood, lactate, heart rate, basically all things metabolic and cardiovascular. And my biggest takeaways were I've ordered a lot more lactate strips and my fingers are really bruised because I've been doing a lot of lactate testing. And that was something that I got a lactate meter maybe like 3 or 4 months ago and just kind of started playing around with it. He was adamant that this is a really important tool and you really want to dial this in and figure out exactly where these various thresholds are, and make sure that, especially when we're talking about the actual Everest attempt itself and anything really long, that we're staying on the right side of those red lines. And, essentially just getting more data and getting used to it and being able to, in the same way that now I've been using heart rate for a very long time and I can kind of guesstimate where my heart rate is going to be just based on how I feel. I think the idea is to be able to do something similar with lactate so that you're staying on the right side of that red line in an effort that's going to be, say, 15, 20, 30 hours, whatever it is on Everest. We want to make sure that we're not generating too much lactate and that we're clearing it all out. And also that we're training at the right intensities to move those lines in the right direction, that we're not training too hard, but also that we're testing regularly to make sure that we're getting an appropriate stimulus. So I would say those were the big things that we talked about. Would be, yeah, the lactate stuff. Let's see. Also, like some blood value stuff. He was talking about making sure I was getting ferritin, iron, hemoglobin, like stuff that's not rocket science, but just keeping track of that, especially as I'm in heavy training volume at altitude here. Yeah, I think those were the big thing was the lactate to me in terms of new things that we're talking about. And we'll talk more about that as we get later into the week. But yeah, Mr. C, was there anything you picked up that I didn't mention from that call, from
No,
listening
I
in?
think that was his big message was be super conservative because,
Hmm.
he talked a lot about muscle dynamics and endurance and his work with various athletes and the importance of lactate in particular and understanding where those thresholds are because basically if you violate those thresholds, especially in endurance sports where you've got many, many hours of activity. If you violate those thresholds anywhere in the early part, you're basically done. You're going to wreck yourself and you're not going to have enough because once you start building up lactate in your blood, which we'll talk a little more about, then it's over. You're going to cook yourself and
Right.
get into the wrong energy systems. And you're going to need those later on because you can't hold off forever. And right at the end, you're going to basically be, you know, going with whatever you can, adrenaline, whatever. But if you don't have that store left, then you're in real trouble. And that happens to a
Yep.
lot of people. He said in endurance racing is that they aren't conservative enough during that first large portion, like 2/3, 3/4
Yeah.
of the effort to make sure and working on understanding exactly where that is so you can train at the right levels. And that kind of training has all sorts of beneficial effects, particular in lactate clearance improvement and mitochondria and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it was great.
Yep. Yeah.
He's a
The
font
other
of
big thing
knowledge.
I wanted to add to that, which we discussed it is a kind of topic for research over the next couple of months, is how really high altitude and hypoxia affect lactate and where these lines
Right.
are. Because that's one of the things that I've experimented on with myself in terms of heart rate, is looking at where's my max heart rate? Where does it feel like those transition kind of zones in heart rate are at various altitudes? Because to me, they do not feel at all constant. I know for a fact, and there's papers about this, that max heart rate drops significantly as you get higher and higher. The problem is there's very, very little science done above, say, 6,000 meters. And when we talk
Yeah.
about the Everest route, it's like almost all of it. Like after 45 minutes, you're over 6,000 meters. So like you're kind of off
Yeah.
the map in terms of what's actually out there, and of proven peer-reviewed scientific knowledge. So it is very much experiment of one stuff. But that's something that I want to do over the next couple of months, is bring the lactate meter, from here in Quito at 3,000 meters up to Ruku at 4,500, up to Cotopaxi at almost 6,000, and then once we're in Nepal, up to the top of Mera Peak, which is 6,500, and then even higher, hopefully, maybe once or twice on Everest. But at least get some sense of what that's going to look like, and having those lines there, so that, like you said, the big takeaway is being really conservative and staying under those lines.
Yep. Yep. And I literally just listened to a podcast with a neuroscientist. And interestingly, lactate is a really important fuel for your brain as well.
I've heard that.
So yeah, so lactate is that was the other thing I learned a lot from the call with Dr. San Milan, was that lactate is maybe one of the best, if not the best, fuels for your body in general. We were
Mm.
talking about it in terms of muscular stuff, but turns out it's also a really good fuel for your brain. So yet another reason lactate's important. So good segue. Let's talk about lactate. So you did a big double day, double T day on Wednesday, and your
Hmm.
morning workouts, lactate rose all the way to 12.5. And then immediately after your workout went to 3.0 after just 30 minutes of easy jogging. So what was the intention to get the lactate? Was the intention, sorry, to get the lactate so high and that in that morning effort? And then what does this rapid drop tell you about lactate clearance and general metabolic efficiency?
So the first answer, or the first question, I wouldn't say I had a target lactate. It was more that it was a session where I was operating above threshold, and I knew that, and I knew that there were some lactate accumulation by the time I was finished. I was pretty surprised to see it that high. I thought it would be maybe like 5 or 6, but I think I was definitely accumulating more than I was able to clear, which is why you see those rises. That's when we talk about threshold efforts, we're talking about being right on the threshold between your ability to clear lactate and your production of lactate. So if you're kind of doing it perfectly, it should be basically net zero.
Yep.
And this is obviously beyond that. It's just a different energy system. And that was okay. It was going into that, but it was definitely, yeah, higher than I expected. It was a good workout, and I felt hard, so that it felt appropriate. But I think that, yeah, the drop in 30 minutes back down to 3.0, for me, that was really, really promising, and maybe the most important metric of the whole day, because it shows really, really high efficiency of clearing of lactate, which also kind of makes sense with the next question that we're going to talk about, which is seeing that my ability to basically run at a higher pace and maintain lactate the same, even from a few weeks ago. That's the entire idea of threshold training, is you're improving your efficiency at clearing lactate so you can run a little bit faster with the same net zero lactate at the end. So the
Hmm.
clearance is the most important part. I mean, it's also nice to be able to see, oh, you can push pretty hard, because that's when you see those lactate numbers over 8 or 9, that's a pretty high level. And being able to just tolerate that level of discomfort is important, and it's important to practice with, because it usually doesn't feel very good.
Yeah.
But it's about the metabolic efficiency at the end of the day, and that's the really important part.
Okay. So maybe it's worth if we can, between us, explain a little bit about what this is all about. So, you talked about different energy systems and lactate clearance. Can you explain what the lactate threshold is, the demarcation between? So, there's below threshold, above threshold, right? And you talked about it
Right.
being uncomfortable once you got above threshold. So, what's happening there? Can you explain?
Well, so you actually have two lactate thresholds. You have LT1 and LT2 is usually what you talk about. So lactate is a
Okay.
byproduct of exercise that your body secretes into your blood. And I'm not a physiologist. I'm probably going to botch this. So if there's someone like with a PhD listening, I apologize. But essentially, when you exercise, you're at a certain intensity, your body produces lactate. It also produces lactate in other situations, but we'll ignore those for now. Lactate by itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Along with lactate, you also are producing all these H plus, these hydrogen ions, and that's what causes discomfort. And that's the thing that's a problem when it builds up because your blood becomes more acidic, and that feels very uncomfortable and becomes a big problem. Like you said, lactate is actually a fuel, and you can metabolize it in the same way that you can metabolize sugar or anything like that to both feed your muscles and your brain, which is pretty interesting. Now, at low intensities, you produce almost no lactate. So your LT1, your lactate threshold, the first one, is essentially where you start producing a small amount of lactate. And there's a threshold, a window between LT1 and LT2, where in theory, if you're metabolically efficient, you can clear out lactate and those H plus ions faster than you're accumulating it. So your body is generating less than it's able to clear and process and metabolize. And so you end up kind of with like a net zero at the end. That's what we were just talking about. And once you get above that LT2 or near the high end of that, that's where you start to accumulate lactate. And that's where you start to see, these snowballing effects, and you start to accumulate a lot of lactate. So if you're running anywhere from, a 400-meter race to probably like a half marathon is right around the edge. Well, I'll put it in times. Anywhere from like 1 minute to like 60 minutes, you're operating in a range where you're accumulating more lactate than you can clear, which is why those races are so uncomfortable to run from a cardiovascular perspective, because if you test someone's lactate at the end of an all-out 5K, it's going to be incredibly high. It's going to be like 20 or something for a world-class athlete. And whereas if you're running a marathon, we talked about this with Dr. Inigo, you really just want your lactate to be pretty steady. It should be between 2 and 3 the whole time. And if it goes over that, that's when you start to have a bad day, because you're not going to be able to clear it, and then it's a snowball problem, and it's going to spiral out of control. So again, going back to first principles, what we're trying to do is we're trying to move that threshold higher so that you can operate at a higher speed without accumulating lactate. And the idea is that
Yeah.
trickles down, because in reality on Everest, again, I'm probably not even going to be that close to threshold effort. I'm going to be below that, but it's a trickle down thing where as we move that line up, everything else moves up. So we can move faster in mid zone 2, which is really what I'm going to be doing for 20 hours, which is that kind of all day pace where, you can talk in complete sentences. It's not super easy. It's not super hard. It's just kind of moderate. But when you do it for 20 hours in a row, it's pretty hard.
Okay. And then when you get above lactate threshold 2, is that when you go into what they call glycolysis? Is that the different energy zone where you're just sucking carbohydrates, whatever you've got left out of
Yes.
your
So there is
muscles?
a whole secondary thing about metabolism and what kind of fuel you're metabolizing, whether it's fat or carbohydrates primarily. So as you get higher and higher, you're always burning some combination of fat and carbohydrate, is my understanding. And then as
Right.
your intensity grows and your lactate starts to increase with that, you reach what's called a crossover point, which is where your fat metabolism and your carbohydrate metabolism cross. And so now your carbohydrate metabolism is higher than your fat metabolism, because when you're at very low intensity, your carbohydrate metabolism should be very low and fat metabolism should be very high. And then you hit that crossover point, which is similar. It's in that same zone of lactate threshold. And then it starts to spike very non-linearly the other way, to the point where you're burning almost entirely carbohydrate, because it's such an easier fuel for your body to metabolize.
But less efficient, I believe, as I understand it. Also, the lactate side effects become severe, and you
Yeah,
can't keep up the carbohydrate intake with the carbohydrate
exactly.
use, right? So you just get
It's less
exhausted.
it's less efficient, and you have a way smaller gas tank is the problem. So
Right.
you have a
Mhm.
tremendous, everyone, even the skinniest people in the world, have a tremendous amount of body fat. It's why if you're starving in the desert, you can survive for like 30 days, whereas you don't have much carbohydrate, which is why you can barely run a marathon for 2 hours without starting to hit the wall. We talk about the wall,
Mhm.
right? Because yeah, you don't have enough stored carbohydrate in your body. So even with these super fuels and drinks and everything that nowadays people are taking, it's still really hard to keep up with the carbohydrate metabolism, the amount of carbohydrate that your body is burning during a hard effort for more than about 2 hours.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. So now now back to the original question,
Yep,
which was about this. You started your lactate got all the way up to 12.5. I think you answered this, but I want to make sure we made sure we cover it. Is your intention wasn't necessarily to get your lactate that high, as I recall, but just to get above threshold. And that's
exactly.
where you measured it was at 12.5. And then
Yep.
what does it mean that you got back to 3.0 after 30 minutes of easy jog? Is that good, bad? What does that tell you?
I mean, I'm like as new to this as you are, pretty much. So,
Hmm.
from what I understand, that's very, very good clearance time. That sometimes it can take 4 to 6 hours for that kind of
Hmm.
clearance. Now, very light exercise will actually help you clear stuff faster. So, that's why people do like a cool down jog after a hard effort. So, that's the idea. But it is showing really good metabolic efficiency, is my understanding. And that's mostly from like talking to Dr. Claude.
Okay, good. All right. And then your second session in the afternoon, you did 7 3-minute intervals where your lactate actually decreased, went
Yeah.
down during the workout from 5 to 3.5. So, can you explain how you design a session where you're clearing lactate faster than you're producing it and why that's important and valuable?
Again, this was a feature, not a bug, or I guess it wasn't designed, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
I expected hopefully the lactate would be basically static, and I was very surprised to see that it dropped by that much. I think that's a very good sign because again, it's showing that at a speed where even a few weeks ago I would be kind of steady, I would say in lactate, that it's actually going down, that you're clearing it faster than you're accumulating it, even at what is a pretty decent pace. These weren't they weren't crazy fast, but they weren't slow intervals. And that to me, that's a really, really good sign because it's showing that metabolic efficiency. I can't say much more than that because I have so little data on this with myself that I'm still learning about it. But
Yeah.
so far, so
Yeah.
good, basically, is what it seems like.
Okay, good. All right. And then let's talk about your sauna use. So, your heart rate in the sauna dropped a good bit. You started about in the mid 130s, 133, 135, and you were barely at 120 by the end of the week. So, what do you think is the physiological adaptation that's happening there? And how does this help you prepare for your effort on Everest?
I'd say there's a couple things. Well, first of all, it was more like 140, 145 last week, or when I kind of started doing it. So it's a very significant drop, which is pretty interesting. Originally, I started doing the sauna stuff because I was planning to do this race actually today, that I'm obviously not doing, and it's in a really hot part of Ecuador, and so I wanted to do some extra heat stimulus. That said, that I didn't end up doing the race. Sauna has been shown to have a lot of general health benefits as well as cardiovascular
Very much.
benefits that are helpful, especially when heading up to altitude. So, one of the big ones is just an increase in blood plasma volume. That's one of the first things that happens when you do a bunch of heat exposure, whether it's in a sauna or a hot bath or anything like that. I'm lucky enough to have a sauna here that I have access to, and I've been experimenting with that. And this is exactly the kind of response that you would want to see is essentially just your body is freaking out a little bit less. It's not having to work quite as hard to keep yourself at what it sees as a reasonable temperature. So you're starting to sweat earlier. That is tied to the blood plasma volume, and again, that's going to help you with everything at altitude. It's going to help you in terms of going higher and stuff too. But in general, it's that response of seeing the heart rate drop so that your body is working less hard to cool itself. That's the idea. And in terms of how does this help with Everest? Yeah, it's partly just the cardiovascular benefit and increased blood volume before you go over to get really, really high. I think that hopefully will make the acclimatization to higher altitudes even better. And also just general health benefits. I don't know. You could probably speak to this too because you've started using
Yeah.
sauna stuff as
Well,
well.
the sauna is a hot thing right now because there are several studies, and a few of them are quite large and detailed over many years that show what they call all cause mortality, which is the gold standard if you're really trying to measure something for its effect. And all cause mortality, if you use a sauna for 20 minutes 4 times a week, is reduced by as much as 25%, I want to say. So that's
Wow.
unbelievable. That is just an amazing impact. And there's no explanation. Remember, this is causative, not a correlative, not causative. So they're not sure why it is. And you have to be careful because maybe people who, use the sauna are just healthier people or whatever. But
Mm,
the particular study in Finland, I think, is the one that gets most cited because there are a lot of saunas in Finland, and they've followed them for a long time. Was pretty robust and like many thousands of people. So they
hmm,
felt the sample size was pretty good. The research that has been done that I'm aware of talks about the similarity basically to aerobic exercise. If you think about it,
yeah.
you're raising your heart rate, you're raising the heat in your body, you're causing impacts on what they call heat shock proteins, which also happens when you exercise aerobically. And you get similar benefits from exercising aerobically, right? You get better
Hmm.
cardiovascular outcomes and better all cause mortality if you're more fit in general. So that's
Yep.
as much as there is of a hypothesis about why this happens, but it's really hard to sort these things out. But it does appear to have a strong correlative, positive effect, and the best hypothesis is because it's sort of similar, and what you're saying also tracks because as you get more fit, your heart rate drops, your resting heart
Right.
rate drops, and your workout heart rate drops. Takes more
Yep.
effort for you to get to your maximum heart rate. So that's the deal, as much as
Yep.
is known. And certainly write us in if you think we're crazy or if you have newer evidence that explains this better.
Yep.
Okay. So let's talk about altitude progression on the bike. You mentioned that, and this is your bike with your hypoxic mask that you wear to make it simulate even higher altitude than the already high altitude in Quito. So you mentioned your bike wattages at 7,200 meters. Tell me again, that's 20,000 feet, 21,000 feet
It's like,
for
no,
those
it's
of
like
us who
23,000
still think
feet probably.
23,000 feet. So it's very
Yep.
high. And you mentioned that your wattages are much higher than last year for a similar level of hypoxia. What are you seeing that's specific to and you think might be causing these improvements? And you talked about increasing the altitude soon. So when do you think you might increase it?
That's a good question. I think probably in the next block, maybe not right immediately. Yeah, probably at some point in the next couple of weeks, we'll plunk it up another 500 to 1,000 meters. And then, yeah, probably most of second half of February into March at 8,000 meters. And then rest of March at 9,000 meters. And then I'm ready to go over to Nepal. So the idea is like everything we try to do in training is it's gradual. So it seems extreme, but if you kind of like back it up, none of the jumps are humongous, and that's kind of how I've always done things. And in terms of the actual objective measurements, yeah, I mean, it's probably 50% higher power output I'm seeing versus this time last year at similar altitudes on the bike, it's literally the exact same bike. So it's pretty apples to apples, which is really exciting. I think part of that is just literally being stronger. I feel stronger with all the gym work we've been doing, the PT stuff. My body feels really, really strong and healthy. And it's nice to see that in different areas, whether it's like we said at the beginning, that little bit quicker up the Polichaski or a little bit more power out on the bike. I think everything, it just kind of compounds and it's a little bit of a virtuous cycle. And yeah, fingers crossed that we stay on the right side of that.
Okay. All right. And then there's a particular thing you noted on Friday that you played around on the first rock step for a bit to practice some exposure, you called it. So can you talk about what that is, how you're working on this as a psychological help for you to help address the dangerous aspects of climbing and maintaining and at the same time doing it while you're training aerobically under load?
I think the aerobic part is the part that I've got the most dialed. It's the part that I feel the most confident about, and I think it's where I have probably the least room for improvement. If you look at the last couple of years, the nervousness or psychological side, looking at being on exposed terrain, is definitely something that I do way less. It's not something I do every day. So I think it's a small thing. It's, John Waldron often says the dose makes the medicine, and I think this is one of those things with exposure where you don't need a lot of it to kind of get used to feeling just okay, this is this is what this is like. It's a little bit of just getting over that sense of vertigo and recognizing, okay, this is totally fine. I'm actually really safe. I'm very comfortable and confident on this kind of terrain, even if it feels a little bit scary the first time. It's just you haven't done it in a long time, and I'd rather incorporate that a couple of times a week now versus get to Nepal and basically just be running up and down easy trails every day and have to be reminded, oh yeah, this is what like steep mountains are like. This is what snow is like. This is what steep rock is like. Cause the Everest route has a little bit of all that stuff. And so it's a little bit of just callousing the mind and getting ready for that and not doing anything crazy dangerous, but just reminding yourself, okay, I'm confident on this terrain. I'm very comfortable. It feels safe to me. And kind of getting over that initial, monkey brain that kind of like freaks out when you look over a ledge and, it's
Yeah.
really steep or something like that.
Systematic desensitization, they call it technically.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and people have this all over the place. I mean, some people are really scared of flying, and then
Sure.
when they have flown a few times, they feel much better about it. There's just, because it's a natural reaction to a lot of people. Either they're claustrophobic or they're like, "Oh my God, we're something that is really crazy
Like
for a
human
human
apes are not
with a
meant to
monkey
do.
brain to
Yeah,
be doing." Right?
exactly.
Okay, great. And so you're trying to simulate more of what it's like to actually be in the Himalayas while you're not in the Himalayas to get a little bit of exposure to it before you get there.
Yeah, just like
Okay.
when I say exposure, I literally mean like being on something with like exposure below you. So on a
Yeah.
ledge
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
a rock wall or something, you could do this in the rock gym with a harness and a rope on. You can do it with just scrambling up on some kind of easy rocky terrain, but it's literally just the idea of moving smoothly and comfortably, and like you said, not letting that subconscious kind of, is that the type one Danny Kahneman brain, the kind of instinctual
Instinct.
brain take over and like freak out, and suddenly you're you know like all jumped full of adrenaline for no reason. It's like, okay, you're actually totally fine, and just getting used to that.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So on Saturday, you went from 3-minute reps to 4-minute reps. So that's a 33% increase in length, and also increased the total volume from 64 to 80 minutes. So that seems like kind of a big jump. How did that
Mhm.
feel? And what was the pace like compared to your workouts prior to that?
The idea, well, first of all, it was the last day of the block, so I give myself a little bit more wiggle room in terms of week to week kind of jumps. We just said before, I try not to ever make humongous jumps, and I think both of these are like 3 to 4 minutes is fine. 64 to 80 minutes is maybe a little bit bigger than I would have done if it weren't the last day of the block, but they both felt good. And the big thing is the pace felt really steady. And we'll talk about it in a second on the lactate side as well. That was also really steady. I went into it with a range, I'll say. Like, I definitely wanted to do the 4-minute reps, which is reasonable. Like, it's very, very boring. It's like the most boring coaching program in the world, but it's like, okay, I'll do 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute, 5 minutes, et cetera. And you just kind of make them longer. And in theory, we talked about this last week, as you get to longer reps, the delta between each one actually gets shorter. So I think that the week to week changes actually get a little bit easier as you get later into the season. So, and then on the total volume side, I kind of said, okay, I'll do 60 to 80 minutes and just see how it goes. And if the metrics I'm looking at are steady and I feel okay, then I'll go to 80 minutes. And if I feel like I'm really tired or heart rate or lactate is spiking in a way that I don't want it, then I'll stop at around 60 minutes. So it's about having that level of flexibility, and looking ahead, it's always going to kind of be like that, where I'm ideally, yes, trying to make the reps longer, keeping the rest the same. And I probably won't make the volume too much longer than 80 minutes. That seems like probably about where I'll keep it, 80 to 90 minutes max. So it's really more about just making those reps longer so that the overall portion of that, 60 to 90 minutes, say, that you're working out is higher percentage at your target pace and lower percentage of recovery time, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. And then you mentioned lactate stability. So let's get into that. So, because your lactate was exactly 3.2 throughout this entire workout of 16 by 4 minutes. Right? So even
Hmm.
when your heart rate was getting a little high, up to almost 160, mid 160s, let's say. Um, so what does that tell you about where your lactate threshold actually is, and how does that compare with what you were seeing earlier in your training? I know you've only been doing the lactate for a little while, but do you think it's
Yeah.
enough for comparison at this point?
It's pretty surprising. I definitely expected it to be accumulating once the heart rate was in that like 165 to 168 range. And I think it's showing that there's not a perfect one-to-one correlation between heart rate and lactate. Like, that's a thing that I've heard, and I think this is the evidence of that, because I did this lactate test, to kind of where you do a whole bunch of different paces for the same amount of time, and then you get kind of this graph that shows you where your LT1 and LT2 are. And it was saying, yeah, like 162 is really kind of right on the red line. Like, you probably don't want to go much above it. And, for example, that workout that I did earlier in the week on the Polychowski, where my lactate got up to like 12 and a half, I think my heart rate was probably only like barely touching 170. So it wasn't that different than that, but clearly there's a line there. And on one side, it's totally fine. And on the other, it's accumulating really rapidly. So
Yeah.
that's kind of one of the things we're trying to figure out. And again, this is kind of the beginning of this journey, is figuring out where those lines are and how to get a better sense of them and make sure that we're staying on the right side of it. But yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised that it was totally constant. The whole workout was interesting.
Yeah. Very interesting and important because obviously that's what you want, the higher effort with the lactate below threshold. Okay. So you went with a very short recovery that day. You only had a couple of hours between your morning workout, which was already 80 minutes, and starting your afternoon cardiovascular work. So what's the rationale for cutting the time down so much? I think you mentioned the gym being closed, so maybe it's just life and you just
Yep.
need to accommodate. But if there's anything else, let us know. And how does bicarb, Morton's bicarb, which is sodium bicarbonate technically, timing factor into managing two hard sessions so close together? So maybe even start out with telling people what the purpose of sodium bicarbonate is.
Sure. Sodium bicarbonate is a base, which is the opposite of an acid. And so the idea is that people have been actually experimenting with bicarb for like 50 years as a way to neutralize those hydrogen ions that we talked about, which is the byproduct of lactate in your bloodstream, which is what causes a lot of discomfort in high caliber racing. The problem, so sodium bicarbonate is just baking soda. It's the same thing that's in your kitchen in that orange Arm& Hammer box.
Mhm.
And you can just take a spoonful of that stuff. It's exactly the same chemically as these fancy products that are now on the market, like Morton's bicarb product. The problem is that not only does sodium bicarbonate have a neutralizing effect on hydrogen ions produced from lactate, it also has a tremendous effect on your GI system. And for many years, people could not figure out how to administer it. It was an administrative or administration problem, that basically people got explosive diarrhea as soon as they took this stuff,
Oh
which is
dear.
not ideal if you're like trying to run an
No.
all out 800 or something on the track. There's a lot of funny stories. You can look at Let's Run or Google those if you want to read some. And
Okay.
Morton, full disclosure, they've been a sponsor of mine for a while, but they pioneered this product, their bicarb product, which is they take the sodium bicarbonate and they encapsulate it in what's called a hydrogel. I'm really hand wavy here because I don't understand the physiology of it that well, but essentially it goes into your gut in such a way that I don't know if it's absorbed slower, but something about how it's absorbed is different.
Well, if it's encapsulated, yeah, it's either, there's usually two effects of encapsulation. One is you're bypassing certain digestive areas. So
Yeah,
if the problem is caused in your stomach, you can encapsulate it in something that doesn't get digested until it gets into your intestines, or vice
right.
versa, whatever area seems to be the problem. And as you're saying, it can also be that it's just slower. So
Yeah,
the total release may be a threshold problem where if you release it all at once, it causes problems. But if you just make it harder to tear apart that encapsulation, then it's a
yeah.
slower digesting. So it can be either one. I don't know which one this is.
Yeah. So, anyways, it's impacting the where and how and when it gets digested, and it seems to be for many people much more tolerable than just taking a spoonful of straight baking soda off the shelf. That said, now getting back to the timing, for me, I've found you want about 2 hours between when you ingest this stuff and when you actually start working out, because there definitely is still some GI funkiness that I experience, some pooping, some farting, some burping, all that kind of good stuff. But
So
it
you want to
usually
get that
moves
out of the
out pretty
way? Is
quick.
that the idea?
Yeah, and it's not like explosive or uncontrollable, but it definitely like there's some gurgling and stuff going on down there that you don't want to be like taking this and then hopping on the track immediately or something.
Okay.
So that's part of the two
But the
hours.
reason you
Was that
take it beyond, so these are what you have to put up with. But the point of
Yeah.
taking it is to get rid of acid, to get rid of these acidic hydrogen ions.
Right. And so this is actually something I learned this week, which is because I always thought that it was lowering your actual lactate levels in your blood, but what it's actually doing is it's balancing out those H plus, those hydrogen ions.
Yeah.
And so your lactate level is actually, if anything, it will be higher because you're lowering the perceived exertion by bringing down or neutralizing those ions. So you're making it
Yeah.
less uncomfortable to be at a higher level of lactate in your blood. So, because yeah, the first time I took it before that workout on earlier in the week where my lactate got super high, and I was like, "Huh, that's surprising." And I was asking ChatGPT about it, and it was explaining, "Okay, yeah, this is This is
Yep.
why, because you're able to push harder into a higher level of lactate than you would normally because it's less uncomfortable. Your body has it's basically muting one of your body's kind of alarm systems of saying you're working too hard. So
Yep.
that's the idea. And then the other part of the timing was literally just I was working backwards from like, okay, it's Saturday and the gym closes at 2 p.m. and I have to finish my morning workout, my second workout, and go to the gym and do a heavy lift, all of this before 2 o'clock. So it's a little bit closer
Yep.
cut than I would usually do.
Yep. So if I'm understanding correctly, let me make sure I'm tracking here because I'm learning as you are about all this lactate stuff. And
Yep.
so, in fact, I think high lactate levels in your blood are good for you because lactate is a better fuel for you. Then it keeps you in the right energy system. It's a better fuel for your muscles. It's very efficient, is my understanding. Maybe the best or one of the best fuels your body can use, and particularly your muscles. But the problem with high lactate is a it's generated most of the time by extreme effort of your musculature, which as a side effect also generates all these acidic hydrogen ions, which makes life very uncomfortable, which is a reasonable feedback for the evolutionary body because it's telling you, hey, you're pushing your muscles too hard. You got to kind of ease off here a little bit, or you're going to hurt
Yep.
yourself, or you're going to faint, or whatever. So
Yep.
is that accurate as you
That sounds
understand it?
accurate to me. Again, like I'm only like one page ahead of you in the textbook, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
still learning, and if anyone is listening to this and is like, "You guys are idiots. You're saying something totally wrong," please write in to me because I'm
Yeah.
very
But
interested in learning about all this stuff.
I remember that's one of the things Dr. Milan said was, these high lactate thresholds. And he talked about, finding ways to get more lactate into the blood without problems, right? Because it's such a
Yep.
great fuel. And I
Yep.
have read that before. And I know enough molecular biology to know sort of why within the Krebs cycle this is really helpful. So, okay. All right. So let's talk about the lactate you measured after that, which you said was the highest you'd ever measured, 13.7. So this was at the end of this
Yep.
second higher intensity session, 13.7, which you said was the highest you'd ever recorded. So walk us through as you understand it, and maybe maybe we just covered this so we can skip it. But what's happening physiologically when lactate gets this high, and why achieving this is valuable in your training?
I think we've talked about it a lot. Basically, you're producing more than you can clear. That's all it is. You're way beyond LT2 to the sense because again, this is only like a 29-minute session or something. So in 29 minutes, you're accumulating 11 millimoles of lactate, which is a lot. So basically, your body is not clearing faster than you're accumulating. So you're producing a lot, and even as we talked about, my clearance levels seem to be pretty efficient, but you're still way, way beyond that because you're accumulating again 11 millimoles of lactate in 29 minutes, which is an awful lot. It's I don't think there's anything else to say there. And then like why this is valuable in training. I think it's more like a byproduct of training. I don't think that other than the stuff that you're saying about maybe metabolizing lactate as fuel and getting into a high lactate state to do that, maybe there's some value in that, but I think it's mostly just I believe that it's important to hit different energy systems. And if you're going to hit a higher end energy system where you're above LT2, then you're going to end up in this
Yeah.
zone anyways where you're
So it's
producing a
like
bunch of lactate.
VO2 max training. You're absolutely going
Sure.
to hit high
Yep.
lactate levels, and you're doing it not even so much for the high lactate, but because you're now doing high intensity exercise is going to train different energy systems and have different cardiovascular effects.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And by the way, one of the things I heard, so this is Dr. Tommy Wood at the University of Washington. I was talking to Tim Ferriss last week or the week before about, he studies neurodegeneration and he's a neurologist. And he said there's a study where they put people on the Norwegian 4x4, which is a very intense VO2 max protocol. Basically, misery defines, you run 85% of max heart rate for 4 minutes and you take 4 minutes off and you repeat that 4 times. People who did that for, I think it was either 6 months or a year, had significantly improved cognitive function that
Hmm.
lasted for years. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, so this was pretty compelling evidence that lactate's pretty important to your brain. So again, this evidence that lactate's a really good fuel. So another
Hmm.
thing, another positive side effect of this kind of training is it appears to be pretty good for your brain at the same time. So there you
Interesting.
go.
All right.
Okay. So let's talk about speed. So your 75-second interval pace is, you said, much, much quicker than you were running last spring. So can you
Mhm.
quantify this improvement? Explain as much as you can what you think is driving it. Is it altitude adaptation? Is it your strength work? The volume of activity? Something else I haven't mentioned? What do you think is going on here? It's
I
good, I
think that
assume, right? This is what
yeah,
you
yeah,
want.
it's definitely good. It's definitely good. I think that the two things that I would point to are number one would be the literal strength work. So feeling physically just stronger. So I've only been doing this lift program for 4 weeks now, but I think that's already, I've started to feel gains from that, feeling stronger. We talked about the PT stuff that I'm doing still for my ankle, that I've increased my ankle mobility by like 50% in 3 weeks. That
Nice.
stuff is huge. I think that's one side of it. I think the other side is what we were touching on before, which is I would always do these sessions as the second workout of the day, the higher end speed. So I would always do the longer intervals in the morning and the shorter intervals in the afternoon or in the late morning. And I think it's just using the lactate meter and even just heart rate more as kind of a speed limit in the morning is keeping that session a little bit more controlled than it might have been in the
Mm,
past. And I'm just
right.
going into these
Interesting.
sessions less fatigued and probably with less
Yeah.
lactate accumulation as well.
Yep.
That maybe I was pushing too hard into a higher end zone where suddenly you're accumulating lactate, you're developing more fatigue in the muscle, and then you're starting the second workout in a way more depleted state, way more fatigued state. So I think that that's another big part of it that can't be ignored is hopefully again, we're kind of dialing in, hitting the really really perfect appropriate intensities for each of these sessions and making sure that we understand what the purpose of each one is.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. All right. And then lastly, you're at the end of a block. So looking back on
Mhm.
this block, culminating in this huge day on Saturday, how would you rate your fitness progression in this block? And what specific things, adaptations are you most excited about carrying into your next block?
I'd say in terms of cardiovascular fitness, I think I'm at or ahead of where I was at this time last year, which is great. And I think in terms of strength, stability, mobility, I'm way ahead. And that part is really exciting because for a long time, I've often felt like my chassis can't quite keep up with my engine. And like I said before, I think the cardiovascular fitness has never been a problem for me. That's always been the thing that I've been able to handle really, really well. It's the musculoskeletal stuff that I think I could use the most help with, and that's where I see the biggest change between even this year and last year, or even 6 months ago in the summer block, is just how much stronger I feel, how much more mobile I feel, how much more I'm able to recover well between workouts. Even now it's I this was all yesterday that we were talking about this big workout, and today I feel pretty good. So I feel like we're really hitting the right zone in terms of things that are hard but are not over the top, and I'm able to recover really well day to day. And now take a few super light days, hang out, relax, and then go do it again. So I think that's the thing that I'm most excited about for the next block. Is it's not just about going and running the Polichowski every day, but it's about feeling really strong and balanced and stable and healthy in a way that I haven't before, and that's really exciting.
Great. Okay. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up this portion?
No, I think that's it. Let's cut here and we'll come back for our cool down.
Okay. So, cool down, the data driven athlete. So, we're going to talk a lot about data here and your approach to it. So, let's start with lactate because that was the theme of the day. You're measuring lactate multiple times per workout, you're tracking HRV, you're calibrating body composition against the DEXA scan you recently had. How did you become so data focused in your training?
I mean, I feel like I'd punt that question back to you. It's like a family thing. I think there's a reason that like 75% and all of the men in our family are engineers. It's probably not a coincidence, at least, by
Yeah.
education. I think we have a certain type of brain. And, I've told this anecdote many, many times, but one of the things that where I kind of fell in love with running as a teenager was because it was very quantifiable. And at the time, I was really into music. I still am, but it felt much more objective than music did. And especially, it felt more like a meritocracy. It felt more fair, for lack of a better word, even though
Yeah.
life is objectively not fair, but it felt like a more fair piece of life in terms of
Hmm.
kind of being a competitive person and all that. So that was one of the things originally that running and endurance sport appealed, that part of it appealed to me was that it was objective, it was numbers driven, it was the time on the stopwatch. This is track and cross country where those are the things that matter. And so I think it all started there. And then, I think I'm just like genetically, I think I have a scientist kind of brain, and I love learning about the sport, and I love learning about training and physiology. And the more you dive into it, just the more there is to learn. And there's a lot of data, and there's a lot of things. And at the same time, like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, sometimes I love to just go out and run in the mountains in the sun and see some cool animals and get up high. And that's great. But also, I really enjoy the part that feels a little bit like science class, especially when it's something new and exciting, like all this lactate stuff that we've been talking about. So it's been a very long thing, but I don't think it's something that's specific to running. I think it's just kind of how my brain is hardwired.
Okay. Yep. So tell us the most important measurements you track, most important metrics that you pay attention to. And are there any that you initially thought were going to be really important, but turned out
Hmm.
not to matter as much as you thought?
The second part of that is a good question. I'm gonna have to think about that. So the first part about what are the most important metrics, I would say in terms of tracking recovery, I think resting heart rate and or heart rate variability are probably the most important. Excuse me. Those are the two that I look at to see, am I getting sick? Am I adapted to the altitude well? Am I overtraining? Things like that. And then during training, I would say, I mean, obviously, pace and speed, whatever metric you want to call that, that's really important. Time on the stopwatch, I guess like time and distance. And then heart rate, I would say, is probably the one that I use the most. Lactate is something that I'm interested in, but I don't know enough about it now to say it's the most important. I've trained for a long time. I mean, I trained for a long time without heart rate either. But I've now trained for a long time using heart rate, and I have a very, very good understanding of how to use that to train myself, I think. And then for the last part of the question about if there was something that I thought was important but wasn't, I don't know that there's anything like exactly what you're saying. I'd say the only thing that I can think of that kind of falls into that category would be horizontal distance, like distance in miles or kilometers, because when I was running flat, that was like the number one thing I paid attention to was how many miles a week is usually what you talk about, 100 miles a week, 150 miles a week, whatever it is. That was the number that was the most important thing that kind of gave me a sense of how hard I was training at a given time. Now I basically don't pay any attention to the horizontal distance. I'm looking much more at vert and hours. And that's really just a difference in the style of training. I think if I were still training to run marathons or even flat ultras, 50Ks and 50 miles and 100K, I think it still makes a lot of sense to track weekly mileage. But for me now, as more of a mountain athlete, it's pretty much irrelevant.
Okay. Okay. So here's an interesting question, and I think about this all the time too. So maybe this is where this comes from. How do you balance listening to the data versus listening to your body? And are
Hmm.
there times when it's in conflict? So I'm a quantified self person as well. And I know that I pay a lot of attention to sleep data, for instance,
Hmm.
because sleep is so important. But I also pay a lot of attention to how I feel. Like when I get up in the morning, does the way I feel reflect what the sleep data are telling me? And if it's not, I find that interesting. Gee, the
Yep.
sleep data says I had a good night, but I don't feel so good, or vice versa. So, do you pay attention to that balance, and does that happen to you where you're in conflict with your data, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. The example, well, I'll start with what you're talking about, the sleep data, because I think that it's a pretty um like buzzword kind of thing nowadays that like a lot of people, whether they have a Whoop or a Garmin or I don't know what the other ones are, but there's like a million things that will give you just like a score for how you slept that night.
Oh yeah,
And
all
this
the
is
watches
why,
will too. I have an Apple
yeah,
Watch,
Apple
a
Watch,
Fitbit
whatever,
will do the
everything
same
will tell
thing.
you how you
Yep,
slept. And the number one thing to
yep,
tell you how you slept is how you feel in the morning. Like, come on, guys. Like,
yep.
I think this is one where the technology has gotten a little bit ahead of itself. And because again, full disclosure, I'm sponsored by Garmin. I wear a Garmin watch like 24 hours a day. So it monitors, my heart rate and HRV and stuff all day and all night while I'm sleeping. And I would say it probably lines up 80% of the time with how I feel and that I listen to, like the sleep score, because it does have a sleep score that it gives you,
Yep,
like your Apple
yep,
Watch or your Whoop or whatever. And
yep,
that is one that I do not really pay much attention to. I will sometimes look at it out of curiosity more than anything and just be like, oh yeah, I feel like I slept poorly and it told me I slept poorly. Like, cool. Great job. But I feel like there's not, yeah, it's not perfect. And for me, like I just said before, heart rate and heart rate variability and just sensation of how I feel in the morning or how I feel like I slept overnight are much, much better indicators of how I slept than their sleep score. I think that the device is just, they're not quite there. The algorithms aren't quite good enough. There have been
I
times where
agree.
I've woken up and I
Yeah.
felt okay, and then my HRV and heart rate are way off, and that I will pay attention to because I just feel like those are things that I understand a lot more and the data seem to be better. The watch just seems to be better at getting those data right versus the sleep score. Sometimes it just feels like it's way off. And a lot of the times I will listen to that. I think it was a few weeks ago. There was a day where I woke up and like I basically rearranged my whole week because I had like 2 days in a row where my heart rate and heart rate variability were way off. And I was like, okay, I'm probably getting sick, or I'm probably overtrained a little bit and I just need to back off. So that's something where I will, even if I don't necessarily feel it, I will pay attention to those data because I've been paying enough attention to them for a long enough time that I trust them to be leading indicators. But the overall sleep score stuff, no, I don't really bother with that. And then in general, like listening to your body, I think is important. I think the best case scenario is you're doing both of these things. And I think ideally, especially for high level athletes, usually you're using the data as a speed limit. You're using it to not push too far or too hard or too fast. You're using it to be more conservative so that you don't go out too hard in a race or so that you don't get into a state of overtraining, things like that. So that's, I'd say, on the bigger picture, that's where sometimes I conflict with the data where I say, oh, I feel great. I'm going to run, I'm going to run harder. And actually, okay, my heart rate is too high. I need to slow down to be in the right intensity so that I don't overcook it.
Okay. Okay. Great. So, what advice would you give to mere mortals, average athletes, that are in runners, whether they're runners, endurance athletes, or whatever, about which metrics are actually worth tracking versus which are just noise? So, we just said, well, sleep metrics probably don't worry so much about.
I think the important thing is that you have to get enough measurements that you understand what the measurements mean for yourself. Because all of this stuff comes with the caveat that a lot of these things will be different from person to person. So, you know,
Yep. So,
like
baselines
max
are
heart
critical.
yeah, baseline, exactly. Max heart rate is a really good example where people talk about, oh, it's 220 minus your age should be your max heart rate. Really, that's an average. So it means if you take 10,000 people, that will be the average for all those 10,000 people will be 220 minus your age. It doesn't mean that's what's going to be for you. My heart rate is actually quite a bit lower than 220 minus my age. And I know other like Connor, for example, his heart rate still gets like above 200 and he's almost 40. So there's a big difference from person to person with things like that. And
Yep.
so for whether it's heart rate, resting heart rate, anything like that, I think the most important thing is to track it for a while and not really try to draw any conclusions. You're just gathering that baseline data, like you said, Mr. C, where you're getting a sense of resting heart rate, I think is a really good one to start with because it's a good way to keep track of just your fitness. Because if you're starting maybe as more of a beginner, in theory, your resting heart rate should go down a little bit. And also, once you're kind of at a point of homeostasis, it's a good indicator of when you're getting sick, when you're overtrained, those kind of things. So that's probably one that
Okay.
I would start with. But any of these, I
Hmm.
would start by just tracking it for like a month or two, not really just noticing it, seeing what it does, seeing if you notice any little correlations with how you feel. In general, I'd say, um, heart rate is a good one to both keep track of intensity of your exercise as well as recovery state. And I don't know, in terms of like which are garbage, I mean, yeah, the sleep scores are pretty silly. Also, like all the training score stuff and like predicted times, like on your, I don't know if Apple and all these others do this, but like Garmin, and sorry, Garmin, if you're listening, like it'll tell you like how hard you're training or what you should do or what your predicted time is in X, Y, and Z. And I don't know, maybe they work more on a general population, but for me, they're like just like complete random number generators. And I think like sometimes Connor and I will just text each other pictures and be like, cool, my Garmin says I could do this today because of this workout. Or like there's one that's also like your performance condition that sometimes like shows up in the middle of a workout and it'll be like having an amazing workout and feeling great. And then it'll beep on my watch. It'll be like performance condition -5. And I'm like, what the hell, guys? So all of those, I just like sometimes I look at them again just because I think they're entertaining, but I would never use those in real life to tell me anything about my actual training.
Okay. Good to know. Yes, and Apple watches are very, uh, they try and be very informative to you in ways that I don't like. We were talking about max heart rate. So my max heart rate is probably close to 165, which is way, I guess in theory, I'm almost 70. So it should be 150, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and, and therefore it's got all of my zones wrong, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so it's telling me I'm in zone 2 when I'm in zone 1 or zone 3, and it's
Yep.
never
But you could
it's
probably
telling me
set
I'm going
that,
to kill
right?
myself.
If you actually wanted
Huh?
to keep track of that, you could probably set that, I'm sure, on your watch and tell
Maybe
it my
you
max
can.
heart
I
rate
don't
is
know.
this. I know you can on
Yeah.
Garmin. I was shit
Yeah,
talking
you
Garmin a little
probably
bit,
can,
and
but
full
it's
disclosure,
just a little
yeah.
crazy anyway. It doesn't really matter.
Yep.
Okay, so if you could only have 3 data points for the rest of your career, would you? What would they be and why?
Okay. I was thinking about this. I read it before. It's a really interesting question. It depends kind of how you define data points, but I'm assuming, okay, time of the activity, like duration, distance, and heart rate. I think with those three,
Okay,
because like with duration and distance, you can also get speed, and with those and heart rate, I think that's all you need, because then you have everything you need to tell the intensity when you're out somewhere. I guess we don't have vertical elevation gain. That's a hard one. I guess it depends. If I'm a mountain athlete, then I swap distance with vert. If I'm a flat athlete, then I'd say distance and time, and then heart rate for both recovery side as well as intensity of the workout.
okay, fair enough. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I will read us out. Thank you guys all, as always, for listening. Please, as always, send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams. You can send those to my email, ty@chosky.run, or DM me, Tyler Sanders, on Instagram. And remember, you can read my raw training logs on my blog at tylersanders.com and get that delivered to your inbox via Substack at tylercandrews.substack.com. Ty's Training is a Chosky Media production and brought to you by the Chosky Foundation, the world's only nonprofit supporting coaching, travel, and community for endurance athletes. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Ciao.
Bye bye.